It's good to be here this evening as we again worship God in spirit and in truth. Before we begin our lesson tonight, I want to show a few of the pictures from our trip down to Mexico. Not very many, so we won't be here that long looking at those. But just a few pictures from the trip that we took. I want to appreciate so much the prayers that were given for us and offered for us, and also the safety that we had. God was with us throughout the whole trip. We didn't have any problems whatsoever. We enjoyed our time together and enjoyed our time there with the brothers and sisters in Christ in Mexico, and we were busy all the time doing the work, so there wasn't much for us to worry about or concern ourselves with. This picture, the first picture, was I took that picture. We were walking along. We were doing just going door to door. I think Wesley was actually with me at that time in Palmillas, and so it was kind of on the left. We were going back, and I kind of saw it, and I thought, that just looks like a great picture. So I thought, I'm going to take it. And so they kept walking, and I just stopped and took the picture. Anyway, it kind of gives a little, just kind of like an ideal. What is Mexico? What's your ideal thought of Mexico? Well, there it is, cactus and I guess the blue sky maybe, and some mountains and a little bit of whatever else that is. I don't know if it's mesquite or what it was. Anyway, that's what we saw. But the next picture is the guys that were there. It was all of us were men this time. There were no women that were able to go. And so we can see who they were there. Jason was with us. Jason was able to give a devotional and was able to teach a little bit there in the devotional. John Griffin, he did some preaching as well. And then there was Wesley. And Wesley had a couple of devotional messages as well, and led singing and several different things. Went door knocking, as did Jason and all of us, as far as that goes. Then next to Wesley is Jaime Hernandez. He and his wife came up from Querétaro, Mexico, about 7 hours south of where we were. Jaime did, I think he preached one time, maybe twice, I don't remember. Of course, his wife was teaching as well. Then there's Fernando Mesa. He's from Texas, out in West Texas, and he came to help us as well and did some preaching and Bible studies and teaching and door knocking also. And then myself, and then John Schaefer, who preaches in Nebraska, he was with us as well. So very good group of brothers in Christ. We all just worked together really well and just had a very enjoyable time taking the gospel. Preached in, I think, 6 different congregations, actually. On Sunday morning, we all split up. We all went to different areas of town. John and Wesley and Jason went to a congregation, and I think Wesley taught, if I remember correctly. He taught the Bible class, and then John preached. I was in another congregation. Brother Jaime was in another. Brother John was in another, and Fernando was in another. So we were all split up among the various congregations in Ciudad Victoria on that morning. Okay. This is when we're going into Mexico. We walked into Mexico. It's just easier for the brethren that take us. They go in, and then they got to wait maybe 2 hours or so to get back into the United States, when it's just to go there and drop us off, and that's about it. So we were able to coordinate all that, and so we walked into Mexico, and this is when they're filling out the paperwork in order to get their visas and pay a little bit of money for those visas. So the picture on the left is actually when we're still on the bridge, crossing the bridge, and the picture on this side, your left, I should say, is where they're filling out the paperwork. Okay. We had groups going out door knocking. A lot of brethren from within the congregations. We would meet at different congregations each day, in the morning, have a devotional, go out door knocking, and so sometimes there were a few of us, sometimes there were quite a few of us, but a couple of the photos of going out and doing some door knocking. Another couple that came to be with us as well was the Bruces. Lucy and Benjamin. There we go. Benjamin Bruce, he was a student at Freed Hardeman, and he's now living in Mexico. He married Lucy. They came down when we were with us a month ago, back in February, back in Playa del Carmen as well. And they helped us with door knocking, and Benjamin did a little bit of translation. He just sent me a message and said, "Brother," we were there, and he says, "Brother Wayne, I'm here and I can do a little translation if you want to have a little break." And I said, "That'll be great. That'll be fine." So he translated, some devotionals, some messages, and at least one night of preaching, I know that, or maybe 2 nights. I can't remember all of what he did. Just a couple of photos of the kind of number of people that we had in those in the congregations meeting together for the gospel meeting. Each evening we would have a gospel meeting. This photo over here was, I don't know, there were probably close to 80 or so people there. That was at Palmias, I think, and this one was at 16th of September, and that was, you can't even see really, it kind of extended on off to the left, I think. And I don't even have a photo of the largest congregation where we were, which was at Once, that congregation. On Sunday night, we all met together. I would say it's the older congregation, one of the original congregations in the center of the town, and I would say their building is about 2/3 of this building, and lots of pews. It probably is the auditorium is about the same distance, maybe a little less, but about that much. And it was filled. All the seats were filled. People were jammed in. So we had a real good crowd on Sunday night, the last night that we were there in Mexico. Okay? These are just different photos of the different ones speaking. Fernando, of course, since he speaks Spanish, he did some translation as well, which was very helpful. For Wesleyan and for Jason. Anytime, he could help out with that, or even Benjamin, I was very thankful that they could do that. It gives me a little bit of break on that part. This was the last night there was a baptism. Actually, there were 2 responses, but one was for restoration and one was for a baptism. And a man came forward to be baptized. This picture I'm with John and John Schaefer. To distinguish the two, we call him 1 John and John Griffin 2 John. That's just the way it is. But he's a member of the church. He was a member of the cartels. He was in prison and all kinds of things. And he brought in his wife was there, his 2 little children, and it was very interesting talking with him. And I didn't get a picture of his family. I just didn't take a picture of the children and his wife or anything. But he wanted to have his picture taken with us. I don't think we asked. I think he wanted to have his with us. So, okay. He has my phone number, too. Anyway, that's kind of another story. I will say I was a little reluctant. Okay. This is our return home after our time in Mexico and preaching and teaching and being with all the brethren. Then we, of course, were able to come home and thankful to come home. This picture up the top is a photo I took right before we walked across the bridge back to Mexico. That bus is what we took down from where we were back to the border. And there they are. They're crossing the turnstiles in Mexico, paying their way back into the United States. So I don't know what it was, 10 pesos or 5 pesos or something like that. I don't know what it was. I can't remember. 6? Wesley says 6. Okay, 6 pesos. Wesley and Jason in the bus riding back toward the border. So anyway, it was a very good trip. We enjoyed the trip, and just, again, I know there's bad publicity on TV about Mexico, but when 99.9% of the people just living their lives. They're just doing what we do. They're just going to school and going to work and going to the store and this, that, and the other. And so when we're down there, that's just what we're doing with them. We're involved in all the daily activities. Our activities involved spiritual things. And so one of the things I say is that being involved in what we're involved in removes a big risk. Generally when you see people that have injuries or problems in Mexico, generally speaking, if you look at the whole story and you look at the context, there's other things happening. And so, we not that it can't, of course, but there is a big risk of it removed by what we're doing and the way that we do those things. So, again, we're thankful for the prayers, thankful for, that we were able to go and to work with them and be with them again. I think Wesley and Jason thoroughly enjoyed it, I believe, and you could talk to them personally and get their perspective and get their thoughts on the trip as well, other than just having mine. So if you'd like to do that, certainly be welcome to do that as well. Tonight we're going to be looking in the book of Judges, about the 6th and the 7th chapters of Judges. In Judges chapter 7 and verse 21, the Bible says there, speaking of Gideon's army, that every man stood in his place. And whenever we're thinking about something that needs to be done, such as a trip such as this to Mexico, there's a lot of planning that takes place. There's a lot of organization that takes place. And every person must be in their place. Every person has a responsibility that's going. Every person, even people down there, have responsibilities, things that they're going to do for us or we're going to do for them, or how we're going to coordinate all of these things. Those that are preaching or those that are teaching, those that are going to have devotionals, whether we're talking about in the gospel meeting or whether they're talking about in a Bible class, every person must be in their place. And it's a responsibility, and everybody must know what they're going to be doing and be prepared for that. Because in order for things to go as they should be. We think about, like for us, when we were going there, okay, we arrived to the border, then we went to a congregation, and a brother there at a congregation took us onto the border, and from there we walked across, and there a husband and a wife met us, and there they took us to the bus station, and then we got on the bus station, and then got to the bus station, and we rode the bus, and then people down there in another town picked us up or gave us vehicles to use. And so it was just a sequence of people that had to be in their place, and everyone was in their place, and everything was in their place. And that's really what we're talking about, and that's what happened here in Judges chapter 7 and verse 21, when he says that every man stood in his place. But the question is, what was the character of these people? Why were they all in their place? Well, first of all, we can see that they were in their place because of their own character. They were courageously serving, and they were willing to courageously serve. Every person that came to be a part of Gideon's army was there because he had volunteered to be a part of that army. He had volunteered personally to go out. But also because of the leadership of Gideon, they were what they were after they became a part of his army. For example, here it says in Judges chapter 6 and verse 12 that it says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor.'" The angel of God called him a mighty man of valor. That was the character that he had within him. It was expressing his faithfulness. It was expressing the fact that he was a person who had the strength of mind to be able to, God knew that he had the strength of mind to be able to confront the enemy that was going to be before them, and that was the Midianites. But in order for those courageous men to serve, those who would come out and be a part of his army. God first was preparing the leader for that army. And Gideon was that man. And Gideon was called a man of strength, a man of valor, a man of honor, we could say. A man who was to be respected because of his spiritual life and the spiritual strength that he had. Well, that's not exactly what Gideon thought of himself. In fact, we go down here to verse 15, and we can see more of what Gideon thought of himself. We go back to verse 14. It says, "And the Lord turned to him and said, 'Go this night of yours, this might of yours, and save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?'" And here was his response. And so here's what Gideon said to the Lord. He said, "Oh, my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my family or my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." We think about what the angel of the Lord had said to him, that you are a man of strength, you are a mighty man of valor. And then what Gideon says about himself, well, I can't because I'm from the least, the weakest. I'm from the weakest in Manasseh and the least in my father's house. Gideon was seeing himself from one way while the Lord was seeing himself in another way. Gideon was seeing himself from a human perspective. Gideon was seeing himself from the perspective of which the world would have looked at him. But God was viewing him from another perspective. And as we think about this, that's why he could be who he was, because of the way God was viewing him. God was seeing the character within him. God was seeing the valor within him. God was seeing the great faith within him. And that Gideon was going to be able to accomplish what God wanted him to do and take this army and lead them against the Midianites. But he couldn't look at himself. He couldn't keep looking at himself or viewing himself or having this perspective of himself. How many other times did it happen? Think about Moses. Think about Moses as God came to Moses and said, "Go back to the land of Egypt." And he began to give excuses of why he couldn't. He couldn't do this and for this reason and that reason. He was thinking about it from a worldly or an earthly, a human perspective, but God was viewing it from another. And as Christians, too many times that's what we do. We see ourselves from the human perspective, or we see ourselves from the worldly perspective, and we end up saying, well, I can't. I can't do this, I can't do that. Oh, I can't lead a prayer, or I can't lead this, or I can't teach a class, whatever. I can't becomes our what we say. And that's exactly what Gideon was saying. He says, I can't. We don't have those words there, I can't. But that's really what he meant. I can't because, I'm from the least of those of the tribe of Manasseh. And even, Manasseh is not a very big tribe. And even the family, I'm from the least. I'm the smallest. I'm the least in my family. And he began to have all these excuses from a human perspective. Well, we can always find excuses from a human perspective. But we need to remember that God has his perspective too. And when God wanted to take Joseph, who had been rejected by his brothers and sold as a slave into Egypt, he could take him and make him the savior of his own family. Or remember when David showed up as Saul and his army was about to confront Goliath. And even David's brothers, and why are you here? What are you doing here? And all the other soldiers were belittling David. They were looking at it from a human perspective. They were looking at it totally from a worldly perspective and not from God's perspective. But God was with David, and God could give the victory. And the list goes on and on. Daniel in the lion's den, and so many others, even to Jesus himself, and how that he was rejected from a human standpoint, because he was not what the people thought he should be, because he was not from the place that they thought he should be, because he did not teach what they thought he should teach. And so he was rejected. But that was only from a human perspective. We as Christians can't view ourselves solely from a human perspective. If that were the case, there'd be nobody preaching. If that were the case, there would be nobody teaching, because you could probably ask almost every teacher or preacher when they first began, or anyone, whether they're talking about children's classes or adult classes, if they thought they could do it, or how did they view themselves. And many think at the very beginning that I can't. It's going to be difficult. But from God's perspective, we can do things for Him, and He can do things with us. Gideon was a man of valor, and Gideon was a man of great faith. And Gideon was a man who was willing to obey. And right here in Judges chapter 6, and so in beginning of verse 24, it says, so Gideon in verse 23, then the Lord said to him, peace be with you, and do not fear, you shall not die. And in verse 24, he says, so Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it the Lord is peace. And to this day it is still Ophrah the Abiezrite. Now it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of the Baal, and that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this rock in the proper arrangement, and take the second bull and offer the burnt offering and with the wood of the image that you shall cut down. King James Version says that wood refers to it as the Ashtaroth. What so many people of God had done, including the father of Gideon, is they had begun worshiping idolatry. They had begun allowing idolatry to come in, because why? Well, they're viewing themselves from a worldly perspective. And so they allowed the idolatry to come in, the Baal to come in, and worship of Baal and building altars to Baal, and the Ashtaroth, the goddess, and so many of these things. But God was preparing Gideon to lead this army against the Midianites. And he was seeing and wanted to see the character of Gideon. And so he says, go to your very father's house. Take his bull of a certain age. Tear down that altar that he has built to Baal. Build an altar, basically to the Lord, to him, to the true God. And tear down the Ashtaroth, or this wooden image that your father has, and use that wood to offer the bull. Now, that was quite a bit for him to do. That was a lot for him to do, but it was going to show who he was, that he was a mighty man of valor. He was a mighty man of valor. And God was using Gideon and his character that he would lead this army. Well, in verse 27, we find out exactly what he did. And it says here in verse 27, and so Gideon took 10 men from among the servants and did as the Lord had said to him. And did as the Lord said to him. He did that very thing because he was a man of character and he was a man of valor. Now, he had said earlier, well, no, I can't because I'm from this and I'm from that. But where did he need to begin? He needed to begin right where he was, in the place that he saw himself as very little. He said, well, I'm the least in my father's house. But yet he could do something. He could tear down the Baals. He could tear down the Ashtaroth, or the wooden image, and he could begin to show them how to serve the living God. All of this was to demonstrate the character of Gideon, that he was a man of valor, that he was a mighty man, that could lead this army. Well, the courageous did arrive. In chapter 6 and verse 35, we find here that Gideon sent out word to all around the land that they needed people to come. Back in verse 33, it says, "And all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east gathered together, and they crossed over and encamped the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew the trumpet, and the Abiezrites gathered behind him, and he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, who also gathered behind him. And he also sent messengers to Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali, and they came up to meet him." He sent out all these word to all these different places. Come and help us. Come and join us, so that we may be able, and essentially so that we may be able to defeat the Midianites. The man who said he couldn't was beginning to see that he could. Now it says here that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and obviously that's referring to a time when the Spirit of the Lord did descend upon people in those kind of ways. He's not going to descend upon us in that way today. He did come upon the apostles in Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, and they began to speak in other languages, and they began to do all kinds of preaching of the gospel and various miracles. And he came upon the people as the apostles went to others and laid their hands upon them, such as in Acts chapter 8 and verses 14 through 17. And so that's the way that he did back then. But we see that here that all these people came and responded. They came and responded. In fact, 32,000 of them came, because in Judges chapter 7 and verse 2, it says, "And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites in their hands, lest Israel claim victory for itself against me, saying, mine own hand had saved me." God knew the character of these people. He knew how it was. He knew that if all 32,000 of them went in war against the Midianites, that they would say, well, we won. And we did it ourselves. We didn't need the Lord. The Lord wasn't there to help us. Because they would have been looking at it from an earthly or physical perspective, a worldly perspective, just as Gideon had been doing. But God said, there's way too many people. And so he says, it's going to take less than that. And he devised a plan here. First of all, whoever needs to go back home, whoever's afraid, whoever has fear, they can go back home. And so here in verse 3, it says, "Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart at once from Mount Gilgal." And 22,000 of the people returned. 10,000 remained. So 32,000 arrived, 22,000 go home, there's 10,000 left. But that's still too many. In verse 4, "But the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many, and we'll test them there for you." So he devised a plan whereby they would separate who would be his army out of those 10,000 people. And this is, when God said they would take it upon themselves to say we are victorious, it's because they would have been looking at it from their own perspective, from an earthly, worldly perspective. And sometimes that's exactly the way that we do. That's the way that we do. We think that we need something from a worldly perspective when in reality we don't. And we're talking about the church, or we're talking about carrying out the gospel, or whatever it takes. Now, obviously it takes people, and obviously it takes funds, and obviously it takes other physical things. But that doesn't mean that we have to look at it totally from a physical or an earthly perspective. So these people came courageously. We have to admire the 32,000 that came, have to admire the 10,000 that stayed. But when it was all said and done, in Judges chapter 7 and verse 7, it says, "And the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lapped I will save you, and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place." So there were 300 left. Not very many. Not very many people to go up against a great army. And there probably might have been some of them saying that we can't do it. And maybe when Gideon first saw the 300 and that's all that was left, maybe in his own mind he was thinking, can we really do this? But he was a man of faith. And as he had said at the very beginning, I can't, but he was beginning to learn little by little that as he trusted in God and as he followed God, he would be able to have the victory because God would be with him. And God was with him. And so it says here in verse 21, then that every man stood in his place. Every man stood in his place around the camp. And the whole army ran and cried out and fled. Every man, all 300 people were there exactly where they needed to be. And because all 300 were there and each one was in their place, then the will of God could be carried out. It may not have been from a worldly perspective, but it was from God's perspective. It might not have even been from their own thinking, but it was from God's way of looking at it. And Gideon's army didn't have to look like the Midianites. What did the Midianites look like? What kind of weapons did they have? What kind of power did they have? We don't know. But they would have had some arms. They would have had some weapons. They would have had some power. They would have had numbers, great numbers. But the Lord's army didn't need to look like Gideon's army, or the Lord's army didn't need to look like the Midianites. And that might be a lesson for us today as Christians, that we, as the church, the Lord's church, we don't have to look like the world. We don't have to look like the world's worldly denominations. We don't have to look like the churches down the street in order to accomplish the will of God. If we think that we do, maybe we're missing the point. If we think that we have to look like the world from a worldly perspective, then we're missing what God is saying. We're missing what was happening here because they did not look like the Midianite army. They were God's army. There were only 300 of them. They were not armed to the same degree, but yet God was giving them the victory. And as we as Christians, we need to be careful ourselves in thinking, well, now the Lord's church needs to look like that down the street, or the Lord's church needs to look like what they're doing. Is that what the Lord said? Did he say we have to do that? Did he say that that's what we should appear? That we should describe ourselves from a worldly perspective? Or should it be from God's perspective? These men were obedient, and that was the character of them because Gideon was obedient. Gideon obeyed the word of the Lord. He just simply went out there and did what the Lord had them to do. He simply went out there and was successful because he was willing to follow the will of the Lord. He was not well known originally, probably, among all the people and among all the tribes. But it's guaranteed that after the 300 men that were with him and doing things the way God wanted him to do it, that he was certainly respected among the people of God later. Maybe not initially, but later he was. And so maybe, sometimes we ask ourselves, and we say, I can't, or how can I? I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not, and the list goes on. But let's do what Gideon did individually. And let's do what Gideon did collectively. And let's simply be willing to serve. Let's simply be willing to be people of valor. Let's simply be willing to be people of courage, to do the will of God, and not worry about what the world's perspective of us is. These people, the 300, were volunteers. When they came out, the 300 didn't know that it would just be them that were left. They came out, and there were 31,700 other men out there. And no doubt they thought, wow, what a great turnout, and we're going to have a victory. But there were only 300. And they learned a greater trust in God because there were only 300 of them than because there were 32,000 of them. And they had the courage to serve the Lord because of the leadership that Gideon was providing for them as well. And they served obediently, every man being in his place. And when it says every man was stood in his place, that's another way of saying that they were obeying the will of God, that they were obeying the instructions that had been given to them by Gideon, and they were following the will with faith. And that's certainly what God wants us to do tonight, as well as Christians, being Christians. Maybe there's someone here that's not yet obeyed the gospel, has not yet put on Christ in baptism, and if you need to do that tonight, then we would invite you to come and obey the gospel, being willing to be baptized for the remission of your sins tonight, if that is your desire and if that is your need. Would you come as we stand and sing?